Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khaled Al-Jaber. I'm the director of Al-Sharq Study and Research Center. If you just join us, welcome to the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. second annual conference. And thank you all for joining us for this afternoon session on the U.S.-Gulf relation, U.S. policy in the Arabian Gulf. Since the spurt of what we call Arab Spring, the Gulf countries are disagreement about almost everything. Regional issues such as the war in Syria, Libya and Yemen, relation with Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey, and how to deal with the Iranian threat. Considering the situation in the Gulf today, GCC crisis, and of the result of this morning public opinion poll indicating that the Arab public prefer the U.S. not intervene with the GCC mediation. This crisis, what I refer to the Gulf crisis, did not just appear to divide only GCC, but also cause division in Washington, D.C. Washington turned into literally GCC proxy war between media, think tank, and the lobbying of politicians. Even the differences between governmental agency, they divided as well. It's my honor today to moderate such a notable panel of experts to discuss the Gulf relation, interest in the region, and U.S. policy and its consequences in the Arabian Gulf. Before I introduce them, allow me to remind you to silence your cell phone, please, and to use the conference hashtag ACWDC 2017. And if you like to ask questions, please complete one of the question card in front of you and hold it to the staff to collect it. I will now introduce our panel and speak in order. Dr. Abdullah Baabood is a director of the Gulf Study Program at Qatar University and a former director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge. His academic and research work focus on GCC state, external relation, and especially in the international cooperation between GCC state and European Union. Dr. Barbara Slavin is a director of the Future of Iranian Initiative at the Atlantic Council and the columnist for almonitor.com. She previously served as assistant managing editor for World International Security of the Washington Times, senior diplomatic reports for the USA Today, Cairo correspondent for The Economist. I can go on, but you're going to find more information in the brochure in front of you. David Roches is assistant professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, MENA, at the National Defense University. He's previously served as an office of the Secretary of Defense for the policy in numerous positions, including as a director of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. And finally, Sheila Carapico is a professor of political science and international study at the University of Richmond. She also taught at the American University in Cairo in 2010, 2012, 2011, 2013. She's also the author of several books and book chapter in civil society in Yemen and the political economy of activism in modern Arabia. I will give you guys 10 minutes for all of you, and I would like to start with Dr. Abdullah Baabood, and I follow you in the minutes by minutes. Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. The talk today is about U.S.-Gulf relations, and I feel that and U.S. policy towards the region, and I feel that my work has already been done for me this morning, and the speech this over lunchtime. So maybe I don't have much to add, but what I would like to say is that when we talk about the U.S. Gulf relations and the Trump administration, we have to remember that that this relationship it goes beyond the presidency, and it goes beyond who is the president of the United States. This relationship between the region, the Gulf region that is, and the United States goes well into many decades, if not over half a century. It's based on certain principles and certain interests that both regions want. The United States obviously is concentrating on energy security, although that has changed somehow, but also the security of the region, its interest in protecting Israel and fighting against radicalization and terrorism. And the region itself is very important in these respects, and it's also at a crossroads with other international countries and regions, and its geographical location becomes very strategic. For the Gulf states, of course, they wanted to have their relationship with the world first and foremost power. The United States, as you all know, has assumed the security of the region since the British withdrawal in 1970s and the American Pax Americana replaced Pax Britannica, as it were. So there was a lot of interest, mutual interest between the two sides. And that interest has been building up over the years. Has been cemented by economic, commercial, cultural relationships, etc. And it's become much more diverse, much more diversified, and it's become much more enduring. Having said that, that is not to also, give you the false picture that there were no challenges. There were a lot of challenges in this relationship. There were differences in priorities, differences in opinions. To recall even the oil embargo in the 70s, and if we want to kind of fast forward the recent Obama administration, there were issues with that in terms of the GCC states. The JASTA, for example. There were also issues with how the Obama administration viewed the Gulf states as free riders, etc. And the relationship, let's put it mildly, wasn't that warm between the Gulf states and the Obama administration. However, things have changed, and now we have a new administration in the US. And despite that, no one in the Gulf, I didn't really know anybody who expected that Trump would win the election. We've seen that the Gulf states have been quick to congratulate Trump and to welcome him to the presidency, and we've seen a number of visits that has been taking place, not only phone calls, but visits by Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Naif, and recently the Emir of Kuwait. This has come at a time when also the region is going through different crises and different challenges. We in the Gulf states are still recovering, if that's the right word, from the effect of the Arab Spring, of the chaos that has been created in the region. There are a lot of conflicts, as you all know, and some people have spoken about this morning, that the region is experiencing. But also, the Gulf region is going through a very difficult period at the moment because of the fall in the oil prices. So we do have some serious economic challenges that are facing the region. And the recent trip by Trump to the region has exacerbated these challenges, and I will come to explain that. But just before I move to that and the Gulf crisis, I just wanted to say that despite all of that, there are a lot of strategic relationship that has been built up over the years. As you know, there is a very strong economic and trade relationship that's building up between the U.S. and the Gulf state. The Gulf states almost make 50% or more, almost 60 and above % of all their exports to the region. And there are, of course, you've known about the sovereign wealth funds and the investments in the Gulf investments in the U.S. And there is a lot of cooperation in terms of technical cooperation, as well as, of course, very deep security cooperation. And this cooperation could only come if the Gulf states were working together as a unity. And as you've heard from some of the speakers, there are Gulf crises at the moment. The whole idea of a GCC is in question, given what has happened and given the boycott that has been that's taken place. And this is going to hamper, in my opinion, and many people's opinion, it's going to hamper U.S. interest and U.S. operations in the region, not only in terms of security cooperation, where you require region-wide security, especially in missile defense and interoperability within the Gulf states' defense structure. But also it's going to hamper economic interest and economic cooperation within the region. Without the GCC, we might see different organizations being set up and fragmentations of the region, which is, this is the least time that we want to see that. And there also is going to hamper the ability of the GCC to work as a force for change in the region, because the GCC, as you know, until now, it's still very much an island of prosperity and stability, and they could help the U.S. other interests in stabilizing the rest of the region, whether that is in Iraq, whether it's in Yemen, but also beyond in Syria and Egypt. So this conflict, unfortunately, comes at the really wrong time, splitting the GCC, hampering U.S. interest in the region. And this is probably a time where the U.S. could put some pressure on its allies and partners in the Gulf states that this is not only bad for you and bad for the region, but it's also it's harmful to our own national interest, and try and push the GCC states to work together as a collectivity, and try and also push them and work with them towards stabilizing Yemen, and not only ending the war, but actually helping stabilizing it, and possibly even including it in the GCC structure. I can even go beyond that and say, like, countries like Iraq and even Jordan and so on could be brought into some kind of cooperation with the GCC. The GCC does not have to continue as it is, as a club of rich, wealthy Gulf monarchies, but it could extend learning from the EU experience to the region, cooperating with them and cooperating with other countries in the region. And especially this is the time that is needed, because only through integration and regional cooperation that the whole region could benefit. And this also comes at a time when the Russians are eyeing the region and interfering in it in one way or the other, and they are very close to the Gulf, as you know. They are already in certain parts of the Arab region. But also, and most important in this case, is also the Chinese. The Chinese are moving in, the One Road, One Belt project that you've heard about. The whole region is reacting to it, and it's going to have an impact on the relationship between the Gulf, the Middle East, and China, and of course that's going to have an impact on U.S. Trade and economic relations with the Gulf. So I think this is a time where we need to deepen this relationship. We need to work hard on it and work hard on and amending this rift within the GCC states, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Slavin, you can start, please. Get the mic.
It's not doctor, it's just Barbara Slavin. But thank you very much for giving me that academic honor. Thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me to speak today. My area of expertise is Iran, and I have to say that the advent of the Trump administration has been very depressing from the point of view of someone who thought that we had made a real breakthrough between the United States and Iran in negotiating the nuclear deal. Now, I know that many of the countries of the GCC were concerned that their issues were not part of this agreement, but of course, if the negotiators had tried to deal with all the issues in the region, I don't think they ever would have reached the nuclear deal. And of course, these other issues would be much more difficult to resolve if Iran were on a path to nuclear weapons. At this point, it appears that the deal may hobble along, but the president has already done enormous damage by questioning this deal repeatedly, by suggesting he might not continue to issue the necessary waivers of sanctions. This has acted as a disincentive to European businesses, Asian businesses that were otherwise considering investing in Iran. And if Iran will do a cost-benefit analysis, and if the benefits, the economic benefits of continuing to abide by these restrictions on its nuclear program are not sufficient, it may choose to withdraw if the United States does not abide by the agreement. So we're in a time of great uncertainty and really a self-inflicted crisis that was not necessary, because we have many years under this agreement under which Iran really would not find it possible to develop nuclear weapons. Now, the Obama administration policy toward Iran and toward the GCC, of course, was not perfect. I, in particular, wondered why President Obama, in an interview, talked about Iran and Saudi Arabia sharing the Persian Gulf, by the way, it's not the Arabian Gulf. I think that was a very unfortunate use of a very unfortunate verb. But the reality is that the countries of the GCC cannot ignore Iran, cannot cut Iran out of the region. I know many Saudi officials have been quoted as saying, well, Iran should just get out of the Arab world. It's not possible. If we look at thousands of years of history, we know that the people of Arab countries, the people of Persia, have been intertwined forever. Religious ties, ethnic ties, cultural ties, and Iran, of course, has been active in countries like Lebanon on behalf of the Shia population of that country long before the Islamic Revolution of 1979. You might remember the Imam Musa Sadr, who was sent by the Shah to improve the fortunes of Lebanese Shia back in the 1960s and the 1970s. So this is an unrealistic demand. There needs to be new thinking that is not zero-sum, that allows Iran to be part of the region and to contribute to solutions, not just to problems in the region. Unfortunately, the Trump administration, I think, is really squandering opportunities. You know, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, gave the United States new options with Iran, and President Trump has thrown these away. He has now basically taken the side of the Saudis, not the entire GCC, because as we know, there are differences of opinion among countries such as Oman, which has been closer to Iran, Qatar, Kuwait, and so on. Even parts of the UAE have been close to Iran. But the president has taken the side essentially of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in a very harsh anti-Iran policy, and of the Netanyahu administration in Israel. And he has essentially subcontracted, it seems, our Middle East policy to these parties and thrown away the leverage that the United States could actually have by having a more robust relationship with the Iranians. We have a channel through the nuclear deal, through the Joint Commission. We had, of course, extraordinary contacts between our Secretary of State, John Kerry, and Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister. Rex Tillerson was in a multilateral meeting with Javad Zarif, but he's not sought any one-on-one talks. And we've seen a return to the sort of axis of evil rhetoric that got us nowhere under the George W. Bush administration. Even more damaging, we have seen a tremendous threat to the people-to-people ties that have grown between the United States and Iran, even as far back as under George W. Bush, when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. We had people-to-people ties sponsored by the U.S. State Department that resumed in 2006. All of this has now been thrown into question, in part by the travel bans that President Trump has tried to impose, the increased restrictions on visas, and so on. So I see that we have a really retrograde policy toward Iran, that we have squandered the leverage that we could have had. If the United States unilaterally breaks the JCPOA, we will also squander the sanctions card, because sanctions against Iran are only really effective when they are multilateral, and in particular when the European Union and countries such as Japan and South Korea join in. And they will have no incentive to join these sanctions if the United States is the one to break the nuclear deal. One other point, and that is this whole notion of pushback on Iran. Lots of talk about pushback and rollback and so on. General David Petraeus had a very good line at a kind of rival conference earlier this week. He said that Iran is great at finding waves and riding them. Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us not to create these waves to begin with. So the U.S. invasion of Iraq obviously was a tidal wave directed against countries in the region. The attempt to ostracize Qatar is a smaller wave that Iran is riding to great effect. So if we want to really deal with Iran, if we want to minimize its influence in the region, we should stop making mistakes that enable Iran to profit at our disadvantage. Thank you.
Thank you. David Roches, 10 minutes. Get the mic.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with these distinguished panelists. I should point out that Dr. Khaled's a new father, so if he falls asleep during my talk, that's all right. And the rest of you might want to put your head down and digest during my remarks. My remarks do not reflect U.S. government policy, and I have my Facebook and my Twitter on there. My son has told me that the sole validation of my worth as a human being is number of Twitter followers, so if you care to validate me, I'd appreciate it. I'm going to speak primarily about unfulfilled promises of Gulf security cooperation, sort of a nutsy-boltsy thing, because quite frankly, I can't compete with this caliber of speakers. And there's three main areas where I'm going to talk about security relations: missile defense, interoperability, and base and logistics. So let's dive right in with missile defense. First off, this is my rough approximation of the time it would take from a missile fired from Shiraz in Iran towards Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. The red circles show what I think the maximum reaction time to be expected from purely national assets. So Emirati missile defense assets tracking this missile. And the green circles, which are kind of hard to see here, but I don't know, they show up better there than they do in front of me, shows the increase in time you'd get. Now notice, my guess, okay, this is a guess, this is not, is that you'd have at most maybe about 6 minutes from a missile launch from Shiraz towards Riyadh. But you can gain a lot of time, like 2 to 3 minutes, which is extremely significant in this realm if the assets are pooled. Quite frankly, the best way to acquire a missile tracking towards Dhahran or Riyadh may well be from Qatar. Whoops, how did I do this? I missed this. Okay, now, in the Riyadh weapons package that President Trump announced so triumphantly, one of the items that was included in it was a Saudi launch detection satellite. Missile defense is most effective. All of the radars have to be cued. This idea of a radar providing 360 coverage, that's World War II stuff. You have to cue the radar. Most radars have to be directed in a certain way, and they need to know about the launch because radars require about 25% of their time to be inoperative for maintenance. So there is a big advantage to having early launch detection, and if the Corker holds are lifted, Saudi Arabia, and conceivably if the GCC ever operates in an integrated manner, would have its own organic missile launch detection system that would then allow it to cue their radars. Now, what does that matter? Well, you have to have a radar to cue. This is a picture of a Taiwanese FPS-132 ballistic missile early warning radar system. This is currently being offered for sale to Qatar. It has not been offered for sale to any other country in the GCC. This is the same radar that we have protecting the United States. So you could have a Saudi satellite telling this radar, hey, wake up, we just saw a launch, and then this radar could provide an in-depth track over Iran's landmass that would then cue Saudi, Emirati, Qatari assets to the potential intercept of the weapon. And my guess, again, guess, is right now we are in a bilateral mode. So what you have here is a series of possible, it's the chart in the middle, you have a series of possible interactions, but it's not optimal. What we want to see is what we have in NATO. The thing on the right, integrated, don't bother taking a picture, just follow me on Twitter and I'll tweet them. Okay? Send me an email. The integrated defense, go for the high resolution. The integrated defense would come closest to that dream of having an umbrella that stops everything. Now let's talk a little bit about interoperability. This is a picture taken earlier on this month at a joint Saudi-Pakistani defense exercise. The Saudi troops are the ones in the helmets. You can see the rifle they're carrying is the AUG-9. It's not supposed to be very good in the field, but everybody likes it because it was used in the Luc Besson film La Femme Nikita in 1990, and a bunch of guys had that. But it looks good. It looks really good. It fires a 5.56 millimeter round. The Pakistanis in the baseball hats are carrying a Mark 57 Chinese copy of the AK. It carries a 7.62 round. So if this unit was operating as a military unit and they came under ambush and all the AUG-9 ammunition was fired, the Saudis would not be able to fire the Pakistani ammunition. The Pakistanis would not be able to fire the Saudi ammunition. That's not the way you want to go. Intellectual operability is even more important. This is the Saudi contingent at the Red Flag exercise at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas 2 years ago. All of these airmen, this is the Royal Saudi Air Force in front of an F-15, all of these airmen participated in the premier multinational U.S. Air Force combat force-on-force exercise to include planning, operational run, and detailed evaluation, which includes criticism. Armies get better from relentless self-criticism. And the American tradition of intellectual operability, which is somewhat alien to this culture, is being absorbed into this, and it has the potential to become a GCC-wide trend. We're currently doing it on a bilateral basis, but it could be done on a multilateral basis. I want to talk a bit about battlefield command interoperability. Imagine the UAE network on the left, let's say it's an air defense network, and let's say they bought it from Philips, a Dutch company. On the right, you have a Qatari network. Let's say they bought that from the United States. If you have different networks, you have to come up with a solution to allow these two to talk to each other. That's the intermediate network. Now, any network, as anybody who ever worked for the government knows, has a degree of inefficiency into it. It will fail or lose signals. So if you assume that each one of those arrows passing information results in a 1% degradation of information, particularly time-sensitive information. And recall, we've only got 6 minutes to track and intercept the missile launched from Shiraz towards Riyadh. If you assume 1%, what that means is just from inefficiency in non-network communications, 1 out of every 25 missiles launched will not be intercepted and will hit its target. 1 out of every 25, the rough equivalent of 3.5 spins of a revolver in a game of Russian roulette. I do not like those odds, and to maintain that degree of institutional inefficiency for the sake of national pride or diversity of supply sources strikes me as not a good deal. Now, finally, I want to conclude with base and logistics. When I say base here, I'm referring to base in the sense of the defense industrial base, not specific bases. Let's talk about military education. My colleague, Bob Sharp, is one of the world's experts on this. He'll be back in the United States in January, and you're going to see a lot about this when he returns. The Qatar MOD has about 12,000 people work for it in a no-war college. UAE, 64,000. United States has 1.3 million and 6 war colleges. What this leads me to conclude is that the right size to sustain a war college, to ensure that you have enough throughput, that you don't cut into your organizational base, pull colonels out of operational assignments prematurely for the sake of getting them educated, is about 151,000 and 212,000. This suggests that there should probably be 1 war college in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and maybe nations spend 3 weeks before or after having them stuff go over national stuff. Instead, what we're seeing is duplicative parallel infrastructure there that cannibalizes the same body of instructors. Quite frankly, instead of succeeding in one institution, we're seeing 5 institutions that are performing at a suboptimal basis. Finally, I want to talk about joint acquisition. The dream of many people, many Americans, particularly for the Gulf Cooperation Council, is that it will become like NATO. I will be giving a paper in December saying that this is not a good idea or that it's deceptive, but it's still a laudable goal. The drone there is the NATO AGS system. This is a joint system. The acquisition is funded by NATO members through NATO organizations, and they share in it. And the airplane on the bottom is a C-17 based at Papa Air Base in Hungary, and the flags you see in front of it are the nations who decided they could not individually afford their own airlift, their own C-17, so they pooled that combination. And that seems to make sense for Bahrain and Oman to have pooled airlift. And there are other capabilities as well, say in anti-mine warfare, naval patrolling, things of that nature, where joint acquisition would provide a much greater outcome than the current individual parallel and isolation system there. And so, with that in mind, I will wait for your most probing and detailed questions, and I will ask Dr. Khaled to wake up again.
Thank you, David.
Just click that.
I'm really scared after your presentation. It's like a war tomorrow. Dr. Carapico, yeah, please. You have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very impressed by this turnout and the panelists. My specialization is Yemen, and so I'm going to say a little bit specifically about the Saudi-led war in Yemen. I've got 3 slides, let's see if they come up, that are basically cartoons by a Yemeni caricaturist named Samer El-Shumairi, who's very generous in letting me use his stuff. I'm not going to talk about these too much. I just want to show them to you. They illustrate a Yemeni view, predominantly a North Yemeni view, that the United States is deeply complicit in the Saudi-led war efforts in Yemen. In this one, Saudi Arabia and the United States are basically preventing international humanitarian groups from even noticing the war in Yemen. In this one, the U.S., the UN, and Saudi Arabia are locking the dove of peace into a cage while the war rages outside. And in the third one, Saudi fighter jet is firing British and American missiles at a bucolic scene. My position in terms of Trump is that really there hasn't been a difference or a big change in American policy towards the Arabian Peninsula over the past several administrations. It always seems to be centered on Saudi Arabia, with the assumption that the entire peninsula is kind of a unit led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It has in the past, and I'm not going to address this because others have, assumed a unified GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. And specifically towards Yemen, the United States has not had a discernible separate policy apart from a policy that treats Yemen as basically Saudi Arabia's backyard. There are all sorts of things that could be said about that, but the two that I want to specifically point to is that at the moment, the U.S. is directly engaged in two of the fights inside of Yemen. One, of course, since not that long after 9/11/2001, we've been engaged in a drone war, predominantly drone war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And that's basically a policy intended to protect the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, since al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is essentially founded to oppose the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its alliance with the United States. And then since March 2015, admittedly this is a little bit complicated, and it follows the Yemeni participation in the Arab uprisings of 2011, which I think were very frightening to the stable monarchies of the Gulf region, and things kind of got very complicated in Yemen, and I don't have time to talk about that at all right now. But essentially, by March 2015, the internationally but not domestically recognized president of Yemen, Abdullah Mansour Hadi, had fled to Riyadh and asked for help restoring him to power, and a Saudi-led coalition launched basically an unprovoked intervention into a civil conflict in Yemen, justified in a kind of broad way as countering Iranian influence via the so-called Houthis, which are a Shia Zaidi movement that had no discernible relationship to Iran previously. But where this is put, and the United States is actively involved in this war. So they arm, as that one cartoon indicates, but there's also in-air refueling of jets. There's help with patrolling, enforcing the naval embargo. There's help with assistance with surveillance and intelligence. So the United States is actively involved in this conflict. This makes the United States also complicit in the war crimes that are being committed by the Saudi-led coalition. And I want to say there that I'm not exonerating the other side, the Houthis and Saleh, who also are pretty brutal, but it's a very asymmetric conflict in which only the Saudi-led coalition has air power or naval power. So the crimes of the Saleh Houthi side are pretty brutal, but they're very minor compared to the damage that can be inflicted from the air, which is considerable. The great irony here for the United States is that we're basically participating in bombing both sides in an ostensibly sectarian conflict. So taking out targets associated with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who, as we know, are Sunni/Salafi, and bombing targets under the control, regardless of who the people are, of the Zaidi, Shia, but also Ali Abdullah Saleh alliance. And the great tragedy from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy is that this war, particularly the Saudi-led coalition, have led to the destruction of social, economic, and environmental infrastructure. The war deaths kind of pale compared with Syria, but the internal displacement is substantial. The destruction, again, of social, economic, and environmental infrastructure is incredible. And one of the most visible and tragic results of that is a cholera epidemic, entirely man-made. Now, the ambassador a little while ago gave a new figure, which was 860 some. It's predicted to reach 1 million by the end of the year. And that's a direct result of bombing water, sewage treatment, and electricity plants. It's not something that happened naturally. It's the weaponization of cholera. So American policy, I think, has not at any point had a clear position or a clear objective specific to Yemen. And this, again, I'm not blaming the Trump administration in particular. It goes back several administrations. We don't have a clear policy or a clear objective, nor do we have a clear sense of what the American national interest is. And I think that although I don't want to present Samar al-Shamiri as speaking for all Yemenis, but these cartoons and plenty of other visual images suggest that the United States is increasingly seen as an enemy, bent on participating in the destruction of the country and the means of the well-being of its citizens, tragically, including incredible numbers of children. Hospitals have been bombed, social services have been completely destroyed, and unfortunately our government is complicit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the speakers. Dr. Abdullah, I would like to start with you. Personally, I thought the Quds are going to attack Oman, not Qatar, because the position of Oman in Yemen, the relation Omanis with Iran. Oman has been watching what we so-called Arab Spring for 7 years as a neutral state. What happened? Why they attack Qatar, not Oman?
Why? Do you mean why the other GCC states
Attack Qatar, not Oman for
boycotted?
the position.
Wow.
Give them time.
1 minute.
I think this is a very good question. I never thought about it, but I think we have to remember that the GCC states, the 6 GCC states, although they have a lot of similar political system and they seem to be having some good relationship between the dynastic rulers and the monarchies, etc., they also have a very checkered history where they have always been competing against each other. There is dynastic animosity between them. There is also mistrust between the leaderships in the GCC state, and this goes historical. And it's not just new for the region, it was also in other parts of the world, but people got over it. We still carry that. We still carry with us kind of a tribal, old medieval mentality, and we have seen it now in the way that they have dealt with Qatar. The GCC is as you know, it's a mechanism for regional integration. It's that is supposed to kind of lead to more integration, cooperation, leading to unity. Integration theory tells us that you have to go through different stages, from a free trade area to a custom union to a common market to economic union, common currency, and then finally political union where you have a unified foreign policy. And even at the EU, which is the most advanced regional integration, you still have differences in their foreign policy. There is strong differences. If you recall, during the Iraq war, the Iraq invasion, there were so strong differences that almost broke the EU. It's very difficult to go to that stage. So while there is the integration process in the GCC is still very shallow compared to what is there in the EU. And therefore, having each state following one policy, it's too ambitious, at least at the stage of the GCC integration. And the best way to do it is that you have, you try and coordinate policies, but you allow each state to have its own independent policy, and by pooling our resources together and by making them feel like their interest is kind of coincide together in one unit, you start bringing and converging these policies towards a common area. Qatar and Oman and Kuwait have very different policies. Even Bahrain at some point, if you recall, Bahrain entered into a free trade agreement with the EU against the Saudi wish. and almost brought the GCC into a crisis because this goes against the whole agreement of the custom union, and that was followed by Oman. Oman has also had, for just answer your question directly, Oman had always followed an independent foreign policy, whether it is the relationship with Iran because of the sensitivities and the way that Omanis look at handling their foreign policy, and in Yemen, Oman disagrees with the war in Yemen and didn't participate. But why did they not do that? And went against Qatar. It kind of puzzles me because Qatar has done everything that the GCC has wanted, especially after 2013, 2014, and the change that took place in the leadership, first of all, but also the agreement they have reached, the Riyadh agreement. Qatar was following the GCC states' policy. Went to war with Yemen, despite I don't think the leadership really believed in that, but yet they didn't want to be seen as not supporting. They did everything that their larger neighbors had wanted them to, and yet they're penalized. And the reason for that is that I think the other countries feel that Qatar is vulnerable, is small, and misunderstood how resilient Qatar has become. They have learned from 2013, 2014 crisis. They have built their own resilience, and I think this resilience has really shocked the other side by not succumbing and to the pressure and not being put in a corner. They are acting as a very strong state, although small, but it's still acting very strong and with principles and dealing with this crisis in a very high moral ground.
Thank you, Doc. Dr. Sullivan, what is the official and society position in Iran toward the Gulf crisis? This is from Dr. Safi Hamid.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think that there has been so much demonization on both sides of the Persian Gulf, and certainly many mistakes that have been made on both sides. Iran managed to reach a sort of modus vivendi with Saudi Arabia under King Abdullah, the late King Abdullah, and in fact Hassan Rouhani was one of the people, now the president of Iran, who was involved in negotiating a security agreement back in the late 1990s with Saudi Arabia that kind of kept the peace between them for quite a while. Obviously, again, the invasion of Iraq, the elimination of the Sunni government in Iraq was a major blow, and I think Saudi Arabia has always been concerned since that time that the balance in the region had been destroyed, and felt that now Saudi Arabia somehow, with the United States, had to be the buffer against Iranian expansion that Saddam Hussein's Iraq used to be. But the real downturn has come under King Salman and under his son. Shortly after the new king came in, the Saudis executed Sheikh Nimr, who was a very prominent Shia sheikh. This caused consternation throughout the Shia world, but of course Iran sees itself as the largest Shia power, as a defender of the Shia, and there were protests in Iran, trashing of the Saudi embassy done by quasi-governmental vigilantes. This is something that should never have happened. The Saudis use this as an excuse to cut relations with Iran and put pressure on other members of the GCC to also cut relations. And then subsequently there was a horrible incident at the Hajj, very poor management of the Hajj, and hundreds of Iranian pilgrims died. And this created a huge crisis between the people of Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, I think the Iranians are they understand that this kind of rivalry is not good for the region, but, they're not wishing Saudi Arabia well, because, of course, Saudi Arabia is constantly inveighing against Iran. And I think it's unfortunate, Saudi Arabia has to, I want Saudi Arabia to succeed. I want Vision 2030 to succeed. And I worry that MBS is using Iran and Iranian expansion a little bit as a kind of scapegoat to distract attention from the problems that he's having in bringing, Vision 2030 to fruition. And unfortunately, again, the United States should be trying to tamp down this conflict instead by siding with the Saudis. It's just making it worse.
David, there is a division in Washington, D.C. A lot of money is going back and forth.
I'm shocked.
You didn't get any from 20 million? I don't know about that. But what do you think the real reason behind this, and who do you stand with?
Well,
do you stand with White House or with Tillerson? I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah, so that's a pretty easy question there. Well, let me take the opportunity to dump on everybody. First off, I think that the country, we're speaking of the GCC rift and obviously the increase in lobbying and expenditures. So first off, I think the countries of the Gulf, their activity seems to indicate that they don't really understand the American system of government. And they think that it's a function of inputs. And in this, they are aided and abetted by people who work in lobbying and public communications and things of that nature, some of whom I count as my friends, but they have gotten the idea that, money, meetings, advertisements, the more you get, the closer you get to your objective, and they don't realize that there's a point at which this all becomes background noise. And I think there are some people who are going to make more money the longer the conflict goes on, and are perhaps not providing advice that is in the best interests of a prompt resolution. Maybe in the best interest of their client, may not be in the best interest of a prompt resolution. That's number one. Number two is, I think there's a fundamental understanding of how America views the region. And unfortunately, I think we're almost at the point where, aside from foreign policy elite, and if you're here in this room today, you are a foreign policy elite. You may not feel elite, but you are. The average American thinks everybody from Morocco to the Indian border is an Arab. And, we've had guys who have attacked Sikh temples because they hate Muslims. So there's the average American, and they speak to their members of Congress. The intricacies of this are lost, and they can't tell the difference between a Saudi and a Kuwaiti and an Emirati and a Qatari. And unfortunately, the longer this goes on, the more that the very hardly fought designation as modern responsible states becomes eroded in the common American perception. This becomes the dreaded T word, tribal. And honestly, that sets the cause of all the GCC states back a generation or more. And so I think that people are so focused on winning the thing up here, they don't realize that they're losing the bigger thing around them. And it's time for all sides to swallow their pride and realize where their long-term best interests lie, and those lay in setting this aside, making concessions which will impact negatively on sovereignty of various countries, and moving forward against the common enemy who refers to it, along with Dr. Slavin and myself, as the Persian Gulf.
Sheila, do you think there is an exit strategy to stop the war in Yemen? And why do you think U.S. involved with this war? Still involved with this war?
I think the U.S. is involved in this war because it has long since had a commitment to the survival and happiness of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think what's been said in Washington is that the Saudi ruling family were particularly upset by the agreement with Iran, and that then heightened American willingness to pursue a Saudi-led agenda, even into, a pointless, cruel, and counterproductive war. In terms of an exit, I think there are conceivably two options, one of which is a genuinely domestic negotiation. There is some precedent for that. I've written about it before. It would be difficult at this point because the social fabric is so torn asunder. And then the other one, so that's one possibility. The other one would be a genuinely diplomatic international effort under the auspices of the UN, perhaps led by countries like the Netherlands, possibly Oman, I don't know, Australia. But that's not what's happened. When those countries, the Netherlands, say, have attempted to enter a diplomatic solution, the US and the UK and some other great powers have tried to treat it as if Saudi Arabia is a peacemaker rather than a party to the conflict. That's completely counterproductive. It's impossible to proceed on those grounds. So either, in my opinion, need serious, old-fashioned, real UN diplomacy, or let the local parties try to negotiate among themselves. But this asymmetric, pretending to be supporting, and frankly, the ambassador who spoke earlier today made it sound as if the US and Saudi Arabia are pursuing peace in Yemen, but they're not. They're pursuing war. And until we get out of a dialogue or a discourse that can't distinguish between diplomacy and bombing, then it's just a disaster. And it's a disaster for the poorest people in the region. I mean, Yemen isn't part of the Gulf. Thank you. Yemen isn't part of the Gulf. Yemen is the most populous region in the peninsula. If you speak of indigenous, I hate the term because it sounds North American, but indigenous people. And they're not part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're part of the Arab Spring, the uprisings, the place where people wanted something better, and where, incidentally, women took leadership in the so-called Arab Spring, Tawakkul, Karman, and so forth. All of that is anathema to the absolute monarchies, particularly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But I think the United States is on the wrong side of both morality, of international law, and of history in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sullivan, how do you see the new strategy against Iran?
First of all, it's not doctor, okay. Again, please. Makes me feel strange to hear that. How do I see U.S. strategy on Iran?
The new strategy, then.
Yeah, well,
President Trump's strategy,
it's
new
very,
strategy.
as I said, it's very backward-looking. It's even worse, really, than George W. Bush, because George W. Bush, in his second term, understood the need for engagement with Iran, both people to people and with the Iranian government. When I listened to President Trump, actually I didn't listen to it, I was on a plane, so I read it. I didn't have to listen to it. But he talks about an Iran, I mean, that bears very little relation to the real Iran, which I've been privileged to visit. This is a country of over 80 million people, very sophisticated, very well educated, very secular. In a funny way, perhaps the most secular country in the Middle East, because people don't like having the Islamic Revolution crammed down their throats. So clerics are very unpopular in the country. And he talks about somehow helping the poor, long-suffering people of Iran. Well, how does he propose to do that? By challenging the stability of the country, by throwing away the nuclear deal, by refusing to let ordinary people travel to the United States. It's just a very strange, it was a very strange speech. It had kind of the worst neocon aspects to it. And I thought that President Trump was supposed to be a practitioner of realpolitik, but I just didn't see it in that speech. So if the strategy is based on basically subcontracting our Iran policy to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, we will be in a very bad place, and I think Iran's influence will continue to grow throughout the region.
Thank you. David, I don't want to see doctor, you're going to get angry with me. So, with your presentation, do you really believe there's going to be a war and Israel going to be like part of it, and they will
Uh,
strike Iran and
Well, who knows? I mean,
Who knows?
there's two ways of looking at military capacity. One is that the Barbara Tuchman view, who was also not a doctor, is that
Just a damn good writer.
that's right. I should note I'm not a doctor either, but I have 2 master's degrees, so you can refer to me as Mama. Where were we?
The war.
No. So Barbara Tuchman's article is that when you build the Guns of August, if you build a defensive capacity, which you see as defensive, from the outside, that may be perceived as a potential threat. That creates a ratcheting effect where you get a reaction, an offensive reaction, or a defensive reaction to the defensive threat, which is then viewed as offensive, and so you get a defensive counter reaction to that, which is then viewed as offensive, and onward, and inevitably you get all the nations of Europe plunged into a war that nobody had. The second one, though, and this plays into the Persian Gulf, Arab Gulf, which is, look, the body of water between Florida and Texas is the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody in America thinks the Mexicans own that or have a claim on it. Why? Because we are confident, assured, and mature. And if you have, so like grow up is what I just tweeted to Javad Zarif about this 2 hours ago, because he said Persian Gulf. I said grow up.
But wait, the Arabs already have a sea, right? So why do they need a Gulf?
I agree. I'd rather have the sea than the Gulf. Yeah, that's right. If you have enough, a country is really dangerous when it thinks it can be a hegemon and wants to expand, or when it thinks it's under threat. The key is to build enough capacity there that you're not threatened. And if you can do that, you have a confident world there, then you have a world that's at peace. My parents are Canadian immigrants. I was born a Canadian citizen, all right? The border between the United States and Canada is undefensible, but we don't worry about it. Why? Because we're both confident, secure nations.
Thanks for Canada.
Yeah.
Dr. Abdullah, you're a doctor. You get the title, I know that. How do you see the next summit in Kuwait? Will be held, postponed? How do you see
Yes.
it?
You tend to choose the difficult questions for me.
I like you more than.
That's a real doctor, he can answer.
Yeah, that's right.
I think there are a lot of real doctors around here. You don't need the title. Well, unfortunately, as many people in this room know, that we are heading towards a GCC summit in December. Unfortunately, we don't have any views whether it's going to be held or not. I mean, we've heard that it might be postponed for 6 months. The Emir of Kuwait tried very hard to see if it can be held on time, but I think the message that he got from his visit to Saudi Arabia, that perhaps they don't want Qatar to be there, which this is quite alarming, because the GCC is made of the 6 countries, the Supreme Council is made of the rulers of these 6 countries, and it's the Supreme Council that has to meet. And any decision that has to be taken, it cannot be taken by one country or the other. The GCC, as many people would know here, is a regional organization. It's a rule-based organization. And if you don't respect those rules, what trust do you have in this organization in the future? And one of the rules is you have to have this annual meeting attended by the 6 heads of states. And no one country can veto that. Because again, the rule of the GCC, the charter says that any decision at a substantial level has to be taken with full agreement unanimously by all the leaders. And decisions that are of less substantive procedural matters can be taken at a level where there is a simple majority. So unfortunately, the decision probably has been taken. I'm not sure that this is not going to happen, and it's taken by 1 or 2 countries, the boycotting countries, the 3 countries of the GCC. without consulting with the other leaders. And this really doesn't bode well for the organization, not only at the state levels, the member states, they will not trust the organization, but also at the popular level. How do the GCC people view this organization? How do they trust it? If the boycott could be done without going to the Supreme Council and not taking at that level, and especially when it really hits one of the main accomplishments of the GCC, which is the common market. The common market calls for free flow of goods, people, and capital. And the boycott goes against this. And this is a decision that has to go to the Supreme Council and cannot be taken by one country or the other. So basically, we are really self-defeating ourselves by making this organization a defunct organization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdullah. Thank you to join us. This is the final. We're going to take 15 minutes and we'll come back to the next session. Thank you so much for having us.